And so it's important as a SANE nurse, as law officers, to understand what happens in that brain that causes these behaviors for a woman not to scream, for a woman not to try to fight. That sounds like, well, maybe then it really wasn't assault. Maybe it was consensual, and in reality, what it is speaks to the trauma. And so to understand that, what happens is the patients don't even understand that. They say, why didn't I scream? One young woman said to me, I invited this guy over. She said, somehow we wound up in my bedroom. He shut the door. I didn't think anything about it. And he grabbed me and threw me on the bed. She said, I was just so shocked. And I just laid there, and I couldn't even scream. If I'd have just screamed, my roommate was on the other side of the wall. I'd have had, why didn't I scream? Why didn't I scream? And so she's questioning herself. She can't figure out herself why she didn't scream. And so when I can explain to her the trauma response, your brain flipped instantly. You have no cognitive realization of that, but your brain flips into a survival mode, and your brain causes you to do whatever the brain thinks will cause you to survive. And in most cases, that is to freeze. You cannot speak. It's not that you didn't or that you wouldn't. It's that you couldn't. You physically couldn't scream. You couldn't move. We call it tonic immobility, a stage of freezing.
Can you please introduce yourself for me?
Absolutely. I'm Deb Wetherelt. I am the Idaho SANE SART Coordinator that's based with the Idaho State Police. I report to the Director of the State Crime Lab. So everyone asks, well, what is that, right? SANE is a Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner. SART is the Sexual Assault Response Team. And so my role is to improve access to standardized care across Idaho for those who've been sexually assaulted. So I teach nurses how to perform the medical forensic examination, and I also do a lot of education with other disciplines, law enforcement, prosecution, advocates, anyone who asks, really. And then I function as a resource for the SART, with the Sexual Assault Response Team is a community-based team of those disciplines who interact to take care of patients who have been assaulted.
Okay, and Deb, I've heard the term forensic nurse. What's the similarity between that?
Very, very similar. Forensic nursing really is the generic umbrella. A SANE nurse, or that sexual assault nurse examiner, falls underneath of that. You could also be a death investigator. There's some other things that you can do, but absolutely we're forensic nurses.
Okay. Now, can you give me a little bit of background of you growing up, family life, what type of student you were, and ultimately, what drew you to nursing?
Okay. Well, growing up, I had a little bit of an unusual childhood. Parents divorced when I was 3 and decided to do something unheard of so long ago, have joint custody. And so I lived a year with mom and then a year with dad and then back and forth. And mother's second husband kind of had what we call an itchy foot. And so he moved a lot. We moved, and I always tell people I never lived a year in one place until after I was married. So I attended 20 different schools before I graduated high school, 4 of them my senior year. So I had an interesting childhood. I was able to see a lot of places. I grew up knowing both parents very well. So there may have been some disadvantages, but I think there's outweighed by the advantages that I had with that. What led me to be a nurse? Well, that's kind of been a question. My grandpa was always so fond of telling the story that at 3 years old, he heard me one day going around the house, I be nurse, I be nurse. And he said, Debbie, why do you want to be a nurse? I said, I be nurse. And he said, well, maybe you'll be a teacher. No, I be nurse. And so I said, where did that come from? He said, we have no idea. But he was always really proud of that. And there was no one prouder than my grandfather when I graduated with my nursing degree, because I really was a nurse. So when I was 16, I was in a fairly serious car accident, was in the hospital for a while, and that really just consolidated my desire to go to nurses training.
Okay, so, and where did you get your nursing degree?
I attended Miles Community College in Miles City, Montana.
Okay, and once you graduated, tell me how your career progressed. What did you start to do?
Okay, so that long ago, that was clear back in 1977, a long time ago, you had to work a year on the general med surg floor. So I did that, and it was an obligatory year. It's not where I wanted to be. I thought I wanted to work with babies, and so I wanted to go to labor and delivery. And I actually did want to go to labor and delivery, but I found out when I got there, probably don't tell a lot of people this, but babies are kind of boring. they're boring from a nursing standpoint. When I was a young nurse, I've outgrown this a bit, but when I was a young nurse, I was kind of an adrenaline junkie. And so what I found out was I really loved the excitement of labor and delivery. When an emergency comes and you've got to be thinking on your feet, moving quickly, and really making a difference, labor and delivery hit that for me. And I stayed there for 42 and a half years.
42 and a half years.
Yeah.
Was there anything in particular that, why labor and delivery? Was there, you said babies are kind of boring, but what made you, was it just the snappy?
Really that adrenaline. I also did some work in the ER, but I figured out really quickly that I was non-therapeutic, shall we say, for handling those who are inebriated. And so that's a common occurrence in the ER, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to be a great nurse for those patients. And on the other hand, it's important for me to know that the work I do makes a difference. And so I found that I could make a difference for those mothers, one at a time. Whether it was a totally, quote, normal delivery, of course, there's not really any such thing, but an uncomplicated delivery, or in the cases where things would go wrong and I needed to do more to help, I became good at it, and I could make a difference.
Okay, so 42 years delivering babies. Why the career change? What happened?
What happened was I became a widow, and I hope a lot of you don't know what that means or what that feels like. Your whole life changes. You lose pretty much everything. And so my life completely catapulted after Wesley died, and I wound up leaving the hospital. And for a while I thought, I'm a grandma, and I just had a great grandbaby, and maybe I'll just do a bit of an early retirement. And then my daughter-in-law called one day and said, hey, there's a job here at the Idaho State Police you need to think about. And I said, honey, I'm not a cop. And she said, no, they want a nurse. I was like, really? Huh. So that piqued my curiosity, and I talked with HR. And although I'd not done SANE exams, obviously, doing labor and delivery for so long, I'm intimately familiar with normals and injuries for anatomy. Absolutely doing head-to-toe exams on women was not, and men, fewer men in labor and delivery, but obviously I knew the ins and outs of the exam very well, and the emotional support, being able to support someone who's vulnerable. What really hooked me was they said they really need someone to take this program and grow it from ground one. And 30 years in my career, I was in nursing leadership, and so as a nursing director, very often that's what you're doing, is program development and growing those programs. And so this really just hooked me from both the patient care aspect, knowing that I can make a difference, and I can make a difference across a large state by helping other nurses learn how to care for these patients. We can change Idaho. And then being able to have the freedom to take this program and grow it where I think it needs to go to provide that care hooked me. So I've been here for 3.5 years now.
So Deb, you had all this experience in labor and delivery, not necessarily this experience as a SANE SART forensic nurse. What type of training did you have to go through in order to become, I don't know whether certified or?
So I wasn't initially certified. Initially, to be a SANE, we call it trained. You take the 40-hour course, and I took that online through the International Association of Forensic Nurses. That's the governing body for forensic nursing. And then I do my individual personal call as a SANE nurse with the Domestic Violence Center in Idaho Falls. So then I was proctored and mentored through exams there, and once I was deemed to be competent, I started doing exams, and I still go over there 48 hours each month for call to do the exams myself. I don't think that I can have respect as an educator if I'm not doing the work. You need to keep your hand into actually doing the work if you're going to expect to teach about it.
So as the coordinator, how many people do you normally teach or instruct per year?
Oh, that's been really variable. Idaho is a small state, which means that our hospitals are small and it's difficult for them to pull nurses. I will do a 40-hour class, for as few as 3 nurses. Probably the average class size is 5. I have done as many as, I think I had one class that had 20. I've had one class that had 15. I have 2 classes coming up next month. They both have a dozen people scheduled. So far this year we have trained 44, and we have another, looks like 38 scheduled. So this will be our biggest year. We've trained between 30 and 40 a year since I started.
Okay. So I want to start getting into the specifics of what you do. First of all, I'm assuming that there's a lot of trauma involved. What type of, is it just being empathetic person? Do you have some sort of trauma training that you go through in order to talk to the victims?
Yeah. So the trauma response and the behaviors that elicits are something that's covered quite heavily in the 40-hour training that you take initially. And then I have pursued additional training individually past that to make sure, because number one, I have to teach it. So I need to understand that well. And so I have done a lot of education on that trauma response, that what happens in the brain. There's actually a hormonal flood, and the way you capture memories change, and your ability to act, your ability to move sometimes is completely annihilated. And so it's important as a SANE nurse, as law officers, to understand what happens in that brain that causes these behaviors for a woman not to scream, for a woman not to try to fight. That sounds like, well, maybe then it really wasn't assault. Maybe it was consensual, and in reality, what it is speaks to the trauma. And so to understand that, what happens is the patients don't even understand that. They say, why didn't I scream? One young woman said to me, I invited this guy over. She said, somehow we wound up in my bedroom. He shut the door. I didn't think anything about it. And he grabbed me and threw me on the bed. She said, I was just so shocked, and I just laid there, and I couldn't even scream. If I'd have just screamed, my roommate was on the other side of the wall. I'd have had, why didn't I scream? Why didn't I scream? And so she's questioning herself. She can't figure out herself why she didn't scream. And so when I can explain to her the trauma response, your brain flipped instantly. You have no cognitive realization of that, but your brain flips into a survival mode, and your brain causes you to do whatever the brain thinks will cause you to survive. And in most cases, that is to freeze. You cannot speak. It's not that you didn't or that you wouldn't. It's that you couldn't. You physically couldn't scream. You couldn't move. We call it tonic immobility, a stage of freezing.
We discussed this earlier, but can you explain, give the analogy that you did to me about victims, how they react to things, I guess for lack of a better term, because there's no practice, as opposed to, like, say, for example, you use the example of a police officer firing his gun over and over and becoming in that. Can you kind of explain that?
So I think we've all heard about the fight or flight response, right? When you get into some type of trauma, you either fight or you run. Well, the reality is there's more to that. There's fight, there's flight, and there's freeze. We're beginning to call it some other things, but for this conversation, we'll call it freezing. And that's where you get into that, you can't move, etc. When you are in a traumatic situation, your brain takes over and wants you to survive. So the first thought is, can I fight? And this isn't going to be a conscious thought, but your brain is going, can I fight or can I run? And so when I talk to police officers, I say, you guys train to be involved in an active shooter all the time. All the time. You guys, you go to the range, you practice drawing that gun, you practice making sure that you know what you're shooting at. And the reason for that is so that when you have that trauma response, you're human, you're going to have that trauma response. But what you train for is so that when you get into that and someone pulls a gun on you, you don't have to think about it. And your brain is going to say, oh my gosh, can we fight? Yes, I'm trained to fight. Pull that gun and fight. And you can do that because you've trained for it. The difference for someone who's been sexually assaulted is that we don't train for that. We don't tell women how to protect themselves there. And so when the brain says, can I fight? Almost always the answer is no. The perpetrator is usually bigger. They're in close. Can I run? They're in close proximity. Maybe you're already cornered and laying on the bed with him on top of you. So fighting and running isn't an option, and that's when the body goes to freezing. So does that kind of answer that
Yeah,
question?
yeah, it sure does. As a forensic nurse, and again, you and I discussed this earlier, can you talk about questioning the victims and not in an interrogating manner, but can you explain how you basically talk to the
Absolutely.
victims?
Absolutely. So again, there are several disciplines that work with the victim. Law enforcement's call them a victim, they're my patient, right? So when I talk to a patient, I do an intake history or a medical history, a patient history. I need to know what happened. So I ask some questions. Some of those questions are some of the same things that law enforcement asks, and that's called an interview for them. So they will interview their victim. I will ask, where did this happen? And I try to use as many open-ended questions as I can. And very often they'll give me an address. Well, I don't really need that address. Law enforcement wants that. The answer to that question, they want that. They're looking for a crime scene. I'm going to ask a little more. Okay, that address, where is that? What I'm looking for is the environment where the assault occurred to try to determine what mechanisms or things that were there that could cause injury to the patient. Because again, I'm a nurse, I do healthcare. So my focus is a head to toe exam looking for injuries. So I want to know what happened, where it happened, what was there that could have injured her. So there's that difference there. I take a history and I take it as it stands. Law enforcement needs to ask more questions. Another question that I will ask is, do you know the name of the assailant? Law enforcement asks the same thing, right? They're looking for a suspect. I'm not looking for a suspect. I'm looking for safety when she goes home. Is this her spouse? Is this a partner? How safe is she going to be when she leaves here? Am I sending her back to the house where that person lives? Or is it a professor at the university? Is it her pastor? Is it someone else? 80% of the time it is someone she knows. So I need that information to really help make a safety plan, to help make her safer when she goes home. So we ask a lot of the same things, but we're doing different things with it.
When you deal with law enforcement, and you've done a little bit of this teaching with law enforcement, what's the, without having this type of training, without having your type of training, and again, I talked about this, what's the biggest, not necessarily a mistake, but in terms of law enforcement interviewing a victim and somehow thinking that maybe they're not really telling the truth here? Can you explain that?
Yeah. Law enforcement is trained to recognize deception, right? They are truth finders. That's part of their job. They investigate. They need to know if someone's lying. The problem is, healthcare is known for a long time that when a patient is traumatized, whether that's sexual assault, a major car accident, witnessing a major crime, that's trauma. You have that trauma response. The behaviors that you see for about 96 hours while that hormonal flood is still coursing through that body, the behaviors that you'll see, the inconsistent answers, the pauses, the looking like they're trying to think of an answer, when in reality the brain's just trying to find that memory because it hasn't been filed yet, looks like deception to law enforcement. When I talk with them, they're shocked. They're like, well, then how am I supposed to question them? How am I supposed to know if she's telling me the truth? If you're telling me that when she's traumatized, she looks like she's being deceptive. And so we can talk about being able to stay in the interview aspect of what they do instead of moving to an interrogation. And probably the most important thing, seeing if they can, they're going to have to get some minimal facts, right? They're responsible for safety. So they need to know where the crime scene was. They need to know how dangerous is that perpetrator? Who is it? Where is he at? Does she know? So those things they have to ask. But then if they can delay the detailed interview until that hormonal flood has subsided, 72 hours, 96 would be better. I say to them, how long do you give an officer after he's been involved in a shooting? How long before you do a detailed interview with him? And the answer has been between 4 days and a week. And it comes instant. Well, we just wait 4 days to a week. Why? And they're not always sure why. And I said, you're doing it so that that officer isn't still under the influence of all those hormones and having that difficulty recalling memories. if you can do the same thing with this patient, my patient, your victim, you'll have a more effective interview at that time too if you can wait. They're very open to that.
How often do you actually teach law enforcement, and is there a program that is kind of in place in Idaho to try and teach more law enforcement people exactly what you're talking about?
So I've done several classes, and basically it's kind of as I'm asked. Officers will attend a training or talk to their SANE nurses. I've had a call from chiefs of police to say, can you come talk with my guys? There's been a couple of times that I got a call from someone who said, hey, you might want to follow up with this hospital because I was told a detective showed up there with a 16-year-old for an exam and they were turned away. Oh dear, that's a problem. So let me go follow up on that, right? But they said they took her to a hospital in this town, and I thought, there's not a hospital in that town. So I said, can I have the detective's name? So I got the detective's name, and I said, so I understood this happened. You took her in, was told, and the hospital told you they don't do the exams. He said, well, that's not quite what happened. He said it really was just a little urgent care. They said, hey, we can't do it, but our mother hospital's not too far away. You can take her there. I will call them, so they're expecting you. He said, and so I talked to my patrol who had taken her in, and we decided that since she'd showered, there probably wasn't, any reason to do the exam, so we just sent her home. And I said, well, can we talk about that? Because the reality is that we can collect evidence for up to 5 days, even if they've had multiple showers, even if they've eaten, even if they've used the bathroom. He's like, oh my. And so then he said, can you come talk to my guys about this? So that's kind of how that will come up very often. ISP has contracted with Detective Angela Weeks. She's retired now. Out of Nampa. She was their sexual assault detective for a long time, and she now does a lot of teaching with law enforcement on the neurobiology of trauma and how they then can better interact with that victim based on those principles of being trauma informed. So last year, I think we had Angela 6 places across the state, and we're doing another 6 or 7 this year. We're also recording a lot of those so that we can put them on the Post website so that the officers can access it in their downtime at work and get post credits for it.
Can you talk a little bit about the process that the victims go through? And you had mentioned about the process kind of wearing a victim down. Can you talk about that? And can you talk about how you can prevent that so that the victim is still comfortable enough to proceed with the whole, I don't want to say investigation because it's not investigation from your standpoint, but just so that they're still comfortable enough to cooperate and go through the process.
So when you say the process, are you talking specifically about the medical forensic exam or all the way through law enforcement and prosecution as well?
Well, you had mentioned when we talked earlier before we began the interview of the victims getting worn down. Mm-hmm. Can you just kind of explain that?
Yeah. So this is having sexual assault addressed is a profoundly difficult process. The whole assault itself is profoundly traumatic. You have been viciously assaulted, even if when I say viciously, I'm not necessarily meaning physical, because 50% of the time we don't see physical injury. There is always, however, emotional injury, 100% of the time. Being believed or not being believed is probably the first step that wears someone down. If they report and that first person says, are you sure that's what it was? Or what do you mean? So getting over that hurdle and then coming to us, the first thing that I do is, number one, tell them I'm sorry this happened to them. Then I'm glad that they came, and I am here to help take care of their health needs. I will do anything that I can, but that they are in charge. And so I give them all of the options for her examination, whether that's a head-to-toe medical exam, forensic collection of evidence, forensic photography, treatment for sexually transmitted infections, unintended pregnancy, referrals for mental health follow-up. Everyone needs that. And so I talk about that. And the fact that process for just to be with me and have that collection done, if she chooses to do the whole thing, will take between 4 and 8 hours, depending on the number of injuries that she has. She's already emotionally exhausted and traumatized, so even just getting through that may be difficult. But what I assure her is that consent is fluid. You can withdraw consent at any time. So a lot of the time they get all the way through it, some of the times they don't. And that's okay because what I'm there for is to provide them with that health care, right? But then if they decide to report, they're going to come in and they're going to talk with an officer there. They're going to have a later interview again. And then it may be days and weeks before they can really get back, depending on where is the perpetrator. And I don't quite know everything that law enforcement does for that investigation, but that can take a long time. Meanwhile, they have to try to reassimilate into life. What they really want to do is be able to forget about this and put it behind them. And so when our criminal justice process is worn out for a long time, and if you don't have a really good social support system, somebody said, like that's the captain of the football team. Are you sure that are you really? So they may get pressure, or it may be a mother saying, "No, honey, Grandpa didn't really hurt you, right? I mean, you don't want to break up the family, right?" Pressure can come in so many ways, and so as that's going on, again, she wants to heal. She wants to be able to move forward, or he. We want to remember this isn't always a female victim, right?
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that. How often is what's the percentage, if you can break it down, between female versus male victims?
This is definitely, sexual assault is definitely a gender crime. 90% of the time, this is male on female. But there are male victims and there are female perpetrators. They're all, there's male and male, female and male. There can be any combination there. But 90% of the time, this is male and female assault.
And how often are drugs and alcohol related?
What I have found with the patient I take care of, about 80% of the time, there has been use of drugs or alcohol. We have to remember, if I could change one thing in our society right now, it would be for everyone to realize that sexual assault, I wish we called it something else, because sexual assault has nothing to do with sex. It has everything to do with power and control. And so very often the perpetrator is looking for someone who's impaired because it's easier. It's like they're hunting. It's easier to capture them. It's easier to exert that control. So with the patients that I have seen, and most of the nurses I'm talking to, about 80% of the time there's been some alcohol or drug ingestion, almost always on the part of the victim, sometimes on the part of the perpetrator as well.
How about violence in terms of, again, I hate to keep bringing this up about prior conversations that you and I had, but you had mentioned, obviously you talked about control from the perpetrator standpoint. How often is violence?
What I have found is that the perpetrator uses the least amount of violence possible to gain control. If you think about it, if the issue is control, the harder you have to work to get that control, the less control you actually have, right? So it's almost, my words completely, but it's almost like an honor badge if you don't have to work really hard to control them. So if you start with someone who's under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and then it's someone that you know, so when you grab them, their whole brain is going, wait, what? And then that trauma response has kicked in, and they learn quickly that a woman will just lay there, or that a victim will just lay there. They may not understand why, but to them it feels like it didn't take very much for them to get total control.
So can you give a percentage on how many victims that you see are actually the victims of a violent attack?
I don't have that statistic off the top of my head. I can tell you that nationally, a little more than 50% of the time, a patient will have no injuries. And then when we do see injuries, very often it will be bruising, lacerations, and abrasions. The actual, where we have an attack type of situation where there really was a severe beating, is much less. I don't have the numbers for that.
Okay. How about one of the jobs that you have also has to do with domestic violence victims? How are you dealing with domestic violence victims?
So from a nursing viewpoint, it really is exactly the same thing. We're still dealing with the trauma approach. We're still doing that head-to-toe exam. We're still trying to give her back control of her own body and autonomy. So I'm not having to do the genital portion of the exam. it really is there then a lot more safety planning. If this is domestic violence, very often she has no choice. People always say, why do they stay? Well, there's a lot of reasons why they have to stay. And so a lot of what we're doing is how can we make it safer if you have to go back until hopefully you can leave. And so we connect them with advocates, victim advocates who can work with them to develop a very detailed safety plan, to work toward the possibility possibly of leaving. How do you need to do that? Can you get copies of important papers out? If you have children, get copies of their school records. Can you possibly squirrel away a little money? Very often they have absolutely no access to money, and that's not always possible. But can you get a little something gathered up and outside of the house so that if the opportunity comes or if the need arises that you have to leave immediately, you can simply pick up your baby and go. So the focus with domestic violence is supporting them through that, believing them. So very often victims of domestic violence aren't believed by anyone. A domestic abuser puts on a really, really good front to the world. And so it becomes very difficult for the victim to come forward and feel like she is believed. So I believe her and listen to her, take into account what she wants, again, restoring control of her own body and autonomy, and then focusing on safety.
I want to focus on just your position now because you spent 42 years delivering babies. Once you started doing this job and dealing with these victims and these type of cases, I know you're a grandmother and a parent. Did this affect the way you parent and deal with your grandkids?
Absolutely.
In what way?
Absolutely. So just through nursing in general, you sometimes see that people aren't always the kindest or the nicest. And so maybe I've always had a little bit of a level of suspicion. But certainly my level of suspicion has risen since we did this. And an example is I have a daughter who is recently single, and she decided to start dating again. And she called me, she says, Mom, I had a date. And I said, okay. And she says, well, I met this guy on an app, and immediately I'm kind of like, oh dear. Okay, breathe, Deb. This is just how people meet these days, right? Okay, just breathe. She says, oh, Mom, no, it's fine. Just listen. I'm like, okay. So I went to his house. You went to his house? Oh my gosh. I'm hyperventilating. She says, Mom, just listen. It's okay. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And so I'm really, really aware that there's a lot of time. I can't tell you how many times that is how the story that my patient tells me starts, right? And indeed, that's exactly what happened. She said I got to his place. He'd come up with some excuse to get me into the bedroom, and then he grabbed me. But my daughter has been trained to fight. And so she actually was able to fight. And she said, I left him hurting on the floor and I left. But my response then is to say, so let's talk about future dating, right? Talking to my granddaughters, please, girls, let's talk about red flags and safety. And just being really aware of, unfortunately, how common violence against children is. And so talking to my grandchildren, how to protect my great-grandchildren, how to protect them online, how to protect them physically, even these days, even when you're out in the mall. So yeah, my trust in humanity has probably evaporated to some degree.
So for you personally as well, do you have trust issues? Are you more careful yourself?
I was kidnapped by a taxi driver 35 years ago. And so my trust issues have been there for a long time. So I wouldn't necessarily say, and everything went okay with that, right? It was so much better than what could have happened. After a couple of hours, I was able to get away. So I don't know that this job has impacted my trust level. Maybe it reaffirmed the fact that I don't trust too many people. I don't take a taxi, for example, ever.
Okay, well, do you feel comfortable talking about that story?
Absolutely.
What happened? How old were you? Where was this?
I was 30 years old. I was taking a business trip, so I'm in a business suit, flew into Dallas-Fort Worth, and taxi driver come up and said, you need taxi? I said, yes, sir. I'm actually going to the Marriott right there. Just you can see it from me. He says, yes, I take. I said, okay. Got into the taxi, and he's in the far right lane. And I said, remember, we're going over here. He said, yes, I know shortcut. And I thought, shortcut? it's not very far. But then he turned. I said, no, wait a minute. You're turning the wrong way, sir. I need to go over there. He said, yes, I take you there. And then pretty soon he's just going further right. And I say, you know what? I've changed my mind. Just take me back to the motel, the airport, please. Take me back to the airport. And he just looked at me in the rear view mirror and kept driving. And I said, I need you to take me to the airport now. He just looked at me and kept driving. And so at the next light, I tried to get out. I couldn't get out. And so over and over, I'm demanding. And he just looks at me and keeps driving and looks at me and keeps driving. And we're getting further and further and further away. We've gone all the way through Dallas, pretty big town. We're now on the outskirts. It's now late evening. And finally, I realized demanding wasn't getting me anywhere. And so I said, I really hate to bother you, but I didn't use the restroom before I got off the plane, and I'm just wondering if you could find me a restroom. He said, okay. So he passed several convenience stores, several places where there's lots of people that he could have stopped, and eventually pulled into a campus that looked like it probably had a lot of professional buildings in it. It's 4:45 in the evening by now, and there's almost no cars there. And so I said, oh, thank you. And so I got out and I grabbed my suitcase and my purse. And I said, I'll be right back. And I went in praying, please, God, let there be an open office. And there was one. And I went in. I said, I need help. I've been kidnapped by this taxi driver. And this woman's looking at me like, what? Can you imagine her? She's just sitting there finishing her day. And some woman comes in a little hysterical saying, I've been kidnapped. I need help. And she said, what happened? And about that time, he burst through that door. He said, you get back in car now, and started toward me. And I swung my suitcase in front of me and said, I'm not going with you. And fortunately, the woman stood up and said, I'm calling the police. And so you could tell he wanted to grab, but he was going to have to come toward me. And she made it very obvious she would have come to my assistance. And he turned and he ran away. Now, you want to talk about trauma response. She had a friend who was a taxi driver. Never occurred to either one of us to call the police. So she called her friend who was a taxi driver, and he'd come in. She obviously had prepped him beforehand, and he'd come in very slowly, stayed a distance, and said, this is who I am, this is my name, this is my wife's name, we have all these children. Deb, I'm going to give you my driver's license so you can keep this. I want you to be very comfortable. And he said, and I was terrified. I was terrified to get back in a car with an unknown man. But I really didn't have a choice. And I didn't think, call law enforcement, that might be safer. Never even occurred to me. When you're under that trauma response, the logical part of your brain, this prefrontal cortex, has shut down. It's not functioning very well. And so you make unwise decisions. I made a decision to get into another car with another unknown man. Fortunately, he was a true gentleman. He said, I want to explain to you, we're a long ways from the motel. We're going to pass this site, and then we're going to pass this landmark and this landmark. I just want you to know so you know that I'm taking you there. And then he gets me there, and I don't remember very much of that drive. I do remember he wouldn't let me pay him. He wished me well. I went up into my room. I shut and locked the door, set my suitcase in front of it. I didn't call my husband. I never told my husband. I never told the police. I sat there for hours, just breathing and reminding myself that I was okay. But I don't take a taxi anymore, ever.
I think it's so interesting that incident happens, and now you're dealing with victims that may be in the same type of, boy, it's like life comes around full circle.
And that I never even recognized that when I first started this. It wasn't until I actually really got into the trauma response work and I thought, that's what happened to me. That's why I didn't bother to call the police. And I've had survivor guilt over that. How many other women has he successfully kidnapped because I didn't call the police, right? So I've recognized that truly was a traumatic response there in those behaviors. So I understand a little bit better that the lack of memory and the inability to recall certain things. It's very real.
Is there a age range of the victims that you see?
Oh, I wish I could tell you it was just like a really tight range, but unfortunately, anyone from newborn to 100 years old or older have been sexually assaulted. It's a horrible endemic in our country.
Do you find a particular age harder to deal with?
Right now, I don't do pediatrics, and a lot of nurses really struggle with doing pediatrics. I think that as much as we hate sexual assault for any of our patients, and so when you've been trained as a SANE nurse for adults and adolescents, you're working with usually around 13, 14 or so and older. And I have a lot of nurses say, I can't even think about this happening to children. I just can't do it. So personally, at this point, I'm only trained to do adults and adolescents.
Does the job ever wear you down?
Not really. Not really. There's a lot of traveling, which I enjoy, but sometimes I get a little tired. Emotionally, I try to take care of myself. I try to make sure, I tell the nurses when I do the training, we have to be on 100%. No matter what happened to us today, it's not as bad as what happened to the patient that we're taking care of. And if it was, then we ought not be there, right? So I'm always able to give 110% to that patient, and I leave there knowing every time that I did that. I try to always leave them with, number one, that they know that I believed them and that there is hope. I always tell them, I want them to know this event does not have to define you for the rest of your life. You're going to be a different person. No one experiences sexual assault and gets over it. That doesn't happen. It's not real. We should never expect that. We do, but that's not real. But I tell them, you can recover from this. It will take hard work. It will take counseling and therapy, but you can move this aside and you can have a happy and productive life. And I want to give them that hope. Number one, it's true. But number two, 1 out of every 3 women who are sexually assaulted, and I apologize, I don't have the number for men, but 1 out of every 3 women who are sexually assaulted will have suicidal ideation. This is how traumatic this is. In the general population, the rate of suicide is 1%. Women who've been sexually assaulted, successful suicide jumps to 13%. Hopelessness will lead to suicidal ideation. And so I always want to give them the hope that this was horrible. I'm not trying to minimize what happened to you. This will probably be one of the worst things that you ever experience, but you can recover. I'm going to give you the resources. It will take work. It's hard work. It will take time, but you can recover, you can move on, and you can still have a good life.
But in your position, it seems to me you're a lot like a psychologist, where you're just constantly hearing the stuff, but what you're hearing is horrific, bad stories. How do you personally deal with that? How do you decompress? How do you separate that from your normal life, for lack of a better term?
Yeah. So I try to maintain a strong spirituality, and I try to get in nature, and I try to take breaks and to remind myself that although the work I do is important, I feel that it is. We've made big changes in Idaho, and I love to be a part of that. It's not all of who I am, right? I'm still a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a great-grandmother, unbelievably. And so those roles are very important to me. And so maintaining contact with family, making time to be with friends. And I have begun limiting the TV shows that I watch, the books that I read. Before I had a lot of interest in true crime. And it's like, yeah, I'm dealing with enough true crime. I really don't need to watch a TV story about it or read another book about it. So I do that. That's a very deliberate, conscious choice. And it's also a deliberate, conscious choice to take care of myself emotionally, because if you don't, you can get PTSD from this job. It's a real vicarious trauma. Absorbing other people's trauma and becoming traumatized yourself is a very real thing. So, and then if I need it, I'll call a therapist. No shame in that whatsoever.
In your position, what's your goal? If pie in the sky, everything was great, all the stars lined up, what would you like to see happen?
Can we eliminate sexual assault, right? But reality is, what can we do in this role? I want to see every healthcare organization have enough trained staff that no matter when a patient comes in, they will have access to someone who knows how to take care of them and has a passion for doing this job. and will do a really good job taking care of them. I want for our police officers to have the tools that they need to do a great investigation. They're so well trained to really continue to do that. But and I think they call it wrapping this case up in a bow and handing it to the prosecutors. And I know there's been times that I've talked with officers and they feel that they've done that. They've really wrapped up this really nice present and handed it to prosecutors, and they've said, sorry, for whatever reason, we can't prosecute. So I would like to see that there would always be someone to care for those patients, and I would like to see somehow, and I don't know that system well enough to know what changes could be made, that we prosecute these people, and that our juries, so therefore all of society, understands sexual assault isn't about sex. This is a violent physical assault using the body as a weapon. It is vicious, and it has long-term life-changing effects, and the consequences for that need to be very serious.
In terms of forensic nursing and the position that you're in, I know there's so many different positions that nurses hold. What would make, if an audience member is listening to this and they go, I want to be a forensic nurse, what makes a good forensic nurse?
I think what makes a good forensic nurse is someone who really wants to make a difference, who can be passionate about patient care and have it be all about the patient and not about you. So although you want to make a difference, you really want to empower that patient and give that to them. I think the passion, wanting to do the work, is probably the biggest thing. I can teach you everything else. If you want to do the work and you are empathetic, you have the skill, you have good people skills, you can listen, truly listen, and support people and allow people to make decisions that you may not personally agree with and still support them. Call me. We'll set you up for some training.
Deb, thank you very much for the interview. I appreciate it.
Thank you for asking.